History is very important, and the event is titled From 9/11 to 10/7. Howard Zinn, really great historian. He passed in the early 2000s, but he would often say, if you don't know your history, it's like you were born yesterday. And I think, we should really reflect on that in terms of why we're here today, and just understand what happened to our brothers and sisters in the past, what's happening presently, and what we are going to see in the future. Because all of that historical context matters. These things don't happen in a vacuum. The government didn't just start waging a war on the Muslim community, as Brother Hudson mentioned, 1986, 87 for his case. But you go back 10, 15 years before that, you've got the war being waged on the anti-Vietnam protesters, right? Who were rejecting the US's imperial adventure in Vietnam and Cambodia, right? Before that, you had other groups, the peace movement, the labor movement. Again, before this panel, Mr. Downs and we were speaking, and I'm not of the generation that grew up during the Red Scare. The Red Scare was that time, where this whole communist threat was going on, right? And so the US government had their list, and they were labeling anyone as, seemed to believe to be disloyal as a potential communist, right? So because of that, then they created these committees, and they were targeting people, and there were blacklists and things of that nature. That playbook that was used then is now in force today. So the model, the template, copy and paste, right? We're all adept at computers. They've copy and pasted that same sort of template today in targeting their new perceived threat, which, several scholars have written about, the way in which Islam has been racialized, right? Because there's not, I think in the Western mind, when you think of Islam, you have this image, right? But for the US, for the Western world, they've managed to racialize the religion, even though it's such a broad, diverse, distinct, very comprehensive faith, right? That goes, every country around the world, right, has representation. And so that also was important, again, in terms of this conversation. In terms of, my journey and why I joined the FBI, it's a little complicated, but I came in out of college, did an honors internship my junior year, and worked in a unit dedicated to investigating crimes against children, child pornography, things of that nature. And so I believe at the time, hey, this was a noble outlet aligned with my values, something I could do that's positive and sort of help protect others, right? And so I finished college, put my application in, and I was selected to join upon graduation. Came in perhaps maybe a week or two after 9/11. And so, everyone says 9/11 changed everything, and it did. The government was embarrassed for many reasons. They believed that, at the time, Congress, politicians across the board were demanding that, hey, we need to either disband the FBI, separate it, have a distinct agency solely devoted to counterintelligence, counterterrorism. So, there was a lot of fear in that regard. So in response to that, the FBI, what they did is they just created this war, right? As George Bush at the time said, we are going to declare a war on terrorism. That war, terrorism is an ideology, right? Terrorism, again, it's depending on your political perspective and your understanding of geopolitics, right? Terrorism means a lot of different things because, from my field of view, when the US goes to wage war in Vietnam, that's terrorism, right? But because we don't really talk about things in that light, again, it's a little bit more complicated. But in terms of what took place after 9/11, And this is mentioned in the New York Times article that Ahmed referred to. You know, I talked about how it was very clear in the early days that a war had been, internally, a war had been declared on Islam as a faith, and the Muslim community specifically. And so everything from that standpoint became dedicated to launching these investigations. There's a journalist by the name of Trevor Aronson. He wrote a book called The Manufactured War on Terrorism. I highly recommend, Terror Factory, yeah. Highly recommend you read it because it details exactly what's been done. And he goes 20 years until now, you know, documenting these cases and then the psychology and the manner in which, you know, a lot of people have always been saying, hey, like, I believe this is happening. I believe that my community is being targeted unjustifiably, but I don't have proof. Well, he provides that proof. And so that was my experience for 17 years. And I reached a point where I couldn't make those ideological compromises and concessions and rationalizations and say, you know, well, I consider myself a good person, right? I consider I'm doing my duty and, you know, paying my bills and living in a nice house in the suburbs, while also conversely oppressing other people who I know for a fact are completely innocent. And so I made a choice. And obviously, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And that reaction was incarceration, imprisonment, you know, demonization by the government, labeling me as a threat to national security, whatever that is, right? But I made my choice in service of something that is far more important. And, you know, we mentioned, you know, like Steve talked about the group that he and others founded, and the Friends of Human Rights and others really stepping outside of ourselves. And, you know, you don't have to be a member of an impacted community to connect with the suffering of that community. It's just your basic humanity, right? And I think living in this culture, we're taught to divorce ourselves from that reality. We're encouraged to see various groups, various religions, various races as, well, they're odd, they have weird food, they eat with their hands, you know, they wear these strange clothes, right? But again, we all have more in common than we have, than that which we believe or are taught to believe is different. And so I think if we come together and we really understand intersectionality and truly find that commonality, then we can hopefully in some way bring an end to some of this oppression. It's one of those things where I think we really have to understand the manner in which there's an exceptionalism applied, right? We believe, we're taught, you know, our children go to school and take civics class, history, whatever it is, and they're taught, hey, we have 3 branches of government, and there's fairness, and, you know, if you just do the right thing, you know, you'll be protected and you'll fall within these parameters. But we have to understand, from a federal law enforcement standpoint, from the CIA, NSA, FBI, right, the highest levels of the government, there's what's called a national security exception to your rights. And so the FBI exists to identify those exceptions, exploit those exceptions, and as we've seen, you know, where we're talking about what's happening in Palestine and the active genocide, right? To this day, you may say, I assert my right to support the people of Palestine. That, in and of itself, can be viewed as a threat to national security. That can be a threat to the established order because it challenges the existing power structure. It challenges the idea that we should somehow align with our ally, Israel, for whatever asinine reason, in spite of what they are doing today, what they've been doing since 1948, right? So we need to recognize, again, you do have your religious rights, but within that, and this is part of, you know, the whole 9/11 blowback of, well, there was an attack on 9/11 and these planes flew into a building, and because of that, now someone has to take responsibility. And so because they can't internally look in and say, hey, perhaps our foreign policy is problematic, perhaps our way of treating the Muslim world, the Middle East, elevating dictators and engaging in some of these really vile tactics on a geopolitical scale. Instead of doing that, we'll just turn within and start placing the blame and inventing terrorists, right? Steve mentioned this incredible book that CCF put together. On the 20th anniversary of 9/11, CCF also put together, and it's on the back table, it's called The Terror Trap. I highly encourage you to read it. But it details, again, how this national security exception has been applied, and there's so many impacted families, but there's also we know about the impacted families directly, right? Because they make the news and you hear about it, and so went to prison for 20 years. But there's other families that you don't hear about. There's other families whose homes whose doors are knocked on at 6 o'clock in the morning. Wish I'd done that, right? There are people who are crossing the international border through Miami International, or through San Francisco, where I come from, right? And who are targeted by CBP, Border Patrol, at the direction of the FBI, where they are scrutinized and interrogated and have their phones and their laptops and their devices downloaded and examined because you don't have a protection at the border, right? And these things are happening, but no one's talking about it because, again, there's that fear, right? And I want to say this because it came up last night. Our goal here is not to fearmonger. Our goal here is not to create this climate of hysteria. Well, you guys should start looking behind you and checking, your rearview mirror every time you drive, or live in this perpetual state of paranoia, because that's not healthy either. But again, to what I said from Howard Zinn, you have to know your history. You have to know what's been done, the war that's being waged, the tactics that are being employed, and protect yourself any way you can. And part of that is education and really removing, the blinders that the system wants you to have on, and just be a good citizen and pay your taxes and, salute the flag or whatever else. But really step outside of yourself and connect with the larger issues of what's happening and speak on it and hold the system to account for its blatant abuses that are happening, right, to your brothers and sisters, or to others who may not even be like you. But again, CCF, I was speaking with Lena and Sarwat recently about, a similar case where it involved members of a group up in Michigan, and they were involved in a plot to, attack the governor. And it was the same playbook. These were, I don't know if they were white supremacists, but they were just, right-wing radicals, as the government defines them. They were targeted using the same exact tactics that the government has been using against the Muslim community. Here in Florida, they're called the Uhuru 3. Same exact tactics. And so we have to understand and identify these connections and recognize what's being done in our name, and demand that this cease and bring some much needed daylight to this. So, so there's again, I talk about national security law. There's a law called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. Under FISA, you are allowed to conduct what's called a sneak and peek search warrant, which allows you to go in to someone's residence, someone's business, someone's vehicle, install microphones, install cameras, search through your computer, search through your devices, your clothing, whatever it is, in furtherance of this narrative that you've presented to a series of federal judges, stating that this person is somehow involved in acts supportive of terrorism or is tied to what they call a foreign power. And so, absolutely. In terms of planting things, like I personally can't really speak to that. I don't know. But I know for a fact in terms of the active infiltration of people's safe spaces, and mosques are not exempt. You know, they have done this. I personally, and I'm not proud of this either, but I've sent informants into mosques with microphones and cameras at the direction of management stating, hey, this imam is believed to be a member of Al-Shabaab, for instance, right? And so that is used then to gather intelligence and, what they define as intelligence, to target and record and create, again, this climate of fear and paranoia. Let me back up first. So there's a term you guys should look up. It's called agent provocateurs. It's a sociological concept that professor, I'll have to find the resource, but he coined it several years ago. And these are individuals whose sole existence is to come into spaces such as this and provoke, right? They exist to create this environment and say, hey, oh, you're a Muslim, I'm a Muslim, let's talk about jihad. And it happens that way, right? Oh, you're on this Facebook group, or you're my Instagram friend. Let me entice you and say things that are illegal because I've been given approval by the government to do this, and let me provoke you. And then what I'll do from that is gather evidence to then support your prosecution. So with, I know for a fact, right? This is legitimate, right? So there was a informant when I worked in Minnesota, right, where they would, it's called, some of the men would wear a camise. There's a way to have a very small pinhole camera hidden in your clothing, and they're able to then come into the mosque. Some informants have watches that are outfitted with microphones. All the things that you believe, and again, you see, some of Hollywood is a little bit off the rails, but they do employ these tools, right, to then come into safe, protected spaces and record. They have what are called concealment devices, for instance. And again, I'm being reticent because I don't want to, again, project fear and paranoia, right? I don't want you to get the impression that we're up here just saying, hey, be afraid and stop going to the mosque, because that's what they want you to do, right? They want you to, again, toe the party line and to be silent and to reject each other, right? And to not have community, which is the wrong answer. So I think, again, we need to be mindful and aware of these realities and recognize, again, when someone's coming to your safe space and they're saying, hey, as, these cases that CCF supports, where someone is they're saying things that are just obviously not in line with the values of the Muslim community, right? Because again, that's the narrative, that Islam is inherently violent. And so because of that 20 plus year propaganda that's been put out there, not just by the FBI, but by the media, by government at all levels, people have made that association. And so we have to debunk that, and we have to really work hard again in advocating for ourselves and showing, unfortunately, that this doesn't represent who we are. Part of it is it's a mechanism of social control, right? Where you want this community to stay in line, right? Where it's this understanding from up top that if you just do as you're told, we'll leave you alone. And so that's always been sort of the viewpoint, at least in my experience. As far as these cases, like and this is documented in the terror trap, and just, broadly speaking, if you look at cases across the board, you're dealing with members who are vulnerable, right? They're on the margins. Economic conditions, perhaps, maybe there's developmental conditions, that make them more susceptible to an agent provocateur. Maybe there are just other issues going on. There was a recent case where a kid, this guy was a kid when he was 15 years old, and he was first, the FBI calls it bump. It's like you bump into someone, but it was a online bump where they have a dedicated group of agents online. They're called online covert employees, and they just spend their time on the internet, in these chat rooms, in these groups, bumping into people and cultivating relationships. And so this one 15-year-old, right, who we all know, those of us, we were all once 15, or we have 15-year-old, nieces and nephews, whatever else. We know the mind, right, and sort of like the emotion and I don't want to say recklessness, but just the inability to kind of think things through sometimes because of your youth. And so the FBI preyed on that, and then they were able to, over the course of several years, develop that relationship. Once that kid turned 18, they arrested him, right? And it's one of those things where I've seen cases where parents have even, unfortunately, they've gone to authorities because they thought that the FBI could help them. They thought that the police could help them. If they just said, hey, my son is kind of going down this path, what should I do? Well, rather than help them, they further lead him down that path and then prosecute him. And that's obviously the wrong answer, right? A lot of this, I think, what I've seen is you're dealing with shame, right? You're dealing with a community that's embarrassed, and so no one wants to be judged and viewed harshly and labeled as, well, you're a bad parent because your son kind of was consuming this literature and they were doing these things. And that's not the right answer either. We have to trust each other. We have to come together and support each other in these moments. And if there is a child, if there is someone with developmental issues that needs help, that person should be brought into the fold, and there should be trusted members of the community who look out for him. We were driving over here with Hatem, and he was telling me about a woman's shelter that they built, and it occurred to me. It's like it's such a beautiful thing, right? Where it's like the answer. We look out for each other. We take care of our own. We protect our own, and I think you've seen these shootings around the country and police terrorism in the Black community and the manner in which lives are just taken like nothing, right? And I saw a woman, and she was giving a speech, and she's like, the answer is not to look to the police for protection. The answer is to look to ourselves for protection, because we protect our own. And I think we have to really change our focus and really understand that those, again, who are vulnerable, those on the margins, not to shun them, but to really try to guide them and show them the right path. And again, if you want to vocalize your anger and frustration with foreign policy, there's ways to do that, and there's obviously avenues, and you shouldn't stifle and suppress your views for fear of angering the government. But you have to, again, Sarwat says this all the time, we live within these borders. And so because we're in these borders, we have to tread with caution, right? And say things in a way that doesn't run afoul of the system, because otherwise, you know, they will turn their attention on you, and they're going to do it anyway, right? Because it's just, you know, completely arbitrary, right? I mean, like, people don't understand. There's a diverse group of men and women in this room. The FBI, in their view, they will open investigations solely based on cultivating informants, saying that I need someone from Syria, or I need someone from Lebanon, I need someone from Iraq, this age, this demographic, this gender, whatever it is. And then they'll devote resources to trying to recruit you. And so that's actively going on. So it's hard, right? Because I think there's this idea like, well, maybe if I just do the right thing, they'll leave me alone. But again, in my experience, nothing that you do will insulate you and protect you, because you just, and you know, we had a conversation last night where I said this, but you know, you live in a perpetual state of being viewed as an other. And I think we need to look at the experience of this country and the way it's always treated others. And the Japanese, right? They were viewed as others. The Irish were viewed as others. Blacks were viewed as others. The native people who used to live throughout every state in this country, they were others until they were no more, and now they are on tiny reservations. And so we really have to understand that, and again, illuminate a lot of these things that are done in the dark, right? That they want you to be silent. They want you to just kind of turn a blind eye and you know, not hold them accountable in any way. You know, I was really encouraged in the summer when I you know, we all have seen, you know, we watch TikTok and Instagram and we see the videos on the college campuses, and you know, Columbia and NYU and a lot of these colleges, and the courage of the youth is just, it's inspiring on so many levels to see them, and the cross section of people, right? Again, because we're taught to divide along racial, gender, economic lines, right? And to continue to view anyone who doesn't look like us as another. And on those campuses, you had a wide swath of people, right? All united in the same shared goal of condemning the US government, condemning Israel for the genocide, for the murder, just the shameless murder of women, children, babies, you know, as they say, in 4K, right? You know, like, you're seeing this and it just shocks the conscience. But, you know, it's amazing, again, to see the lack of fear, right? And we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid to wear a Palestinian pin. We shouldn't be afraid to wave the flag. We shouldn't be afraid to condemn the actions of our government for its complicity, its enabling of these actions. And that's what they want us to do. They want us to, again, sanction this and say, hey, well, it's okay. It's complicated, right? There's two sides to the story, but there's only one side to the story, right? There's genocide and there's life. And as it is now, there, again, what's being done, we all see it with our own eyes, and we don't need to be propagandized and guilt-tripped and led to believe that, oh, if I say this, somehow I hate Jews, right? Which is completely preposterous, because how many Jewish brothers and sisters are out there on the front lines and saying, hey, we also don't agree. We also find this vile and just disgusting. So with the protests, what should you do? Again, if you have someone joining your encampment and they're saying, hey, you know what, let's get out there and let's go blow up a synagogue, well, again, that's just insane, right? Like, that's not why we're here. That's not what we believe. Violence is never the right answer, right? Because it just leads to reciprocal violence and everything else, right? So that's not our position. So being aware of those coming from the outside who are trying to provoke and trying to create a climate where you are encouraged to engage in activity that run counter to your values is very important. And just, you know, again, there's just like this, you have to have this street sense, right? Of knowing not your adversary necessarily, but just understanding when someone is coming here with they don't have pure intentions. You know, the FBI, what they'll often do with informants, they'll send them into mosques, they'll send them into community and say, hey, spark a conversation with someone, but kind of turn that conversation radical. And then this is verbatim, right? Like, I was the agent in the car with an informant. I was the agent in a room with the informant telling them to do these things. So the idea being, hey, perhaps if we touch on a sensitive subject and use that as a basis to inspire anger, right? The person that we're targeting will then eventually commit an act of violence, which we can then use as a feather in our cap to then get a prosecution because, oh, we kept the world safe. But again, as we've seen, as the book that I mentioned, the Terror Factory, these are manufactured cases from start to finish. They're completely invented. Without the government being involved, they would not exist. And so we have to recognize that and proceed accordingly.